Thank you for joining us. Um, I am Fiona Hogan. I am lucky enough to be working on this project with a number of organizations on kind of introducing the topic of marine carbon dioxide removal to the fishing industry and trying to allow for the fishing industry to provide their feedback in this new marine use that we are um, learning about. So as I said, I'm Fiona Hogan. I'm representing the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance. I am the co-PI on this project. Sarah Schumann is the other co-PI on this project from the Fishery Friendly Climate Action Campaign. Unfortunately, Sarah couldn't be with us today. She had an unfortunate conflict, so she's not able to be here. But we're going to do our best to stand in for Sarah and have a great discussion today. Uh, I'll hand it over to Darcy if you want to briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Darcy Dugan. I'm with the Alaska Ocean Observing System, and I coordinate the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, and I'm based in Anchorage. And my part of this project will be writing up some guidance memos based on the information from the roundtables that many of you participated in this spring.
Thank you. Our next project team member, isn't able to join us today. Alex Harper, she works for the California Current Ocean Acidification Network. And that leaves one last member of our team. Austin, I don't know if you want to jump on and say a quick hello and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Austin Pugh. I am the coordinator for the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network, and I'm based out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Thank you. So today, as I mentioned earlier, we have a full agenda. We are lucky enough to have a couple of guest presenters that will kick us off on providing an overview of mCDR methods and potential impacts, and then Brad Warren will be taking us through kind of policy, economic, and governance aspects as well. For both of those presentations, what we're going to ask for folks to do, if you have any questions, to please put them in the chat. We're going to be reserving the questions for our open discussion, which is later in our agenda. So after our guest presenters speak, I'll come back and give you a little overview of our project, and then Darcy will take over and provide an overview of some of the feedback that we've heard from, actually, I skipped a bit. We're going to have a panel discussion first that Darcy will be running that fishing industry members who participated in our Fisheries Roundtable will be providing their thoughts to you all. And then Darcy will cover some of the feedback that we've received so far throughout this project, and we'll take you through some of the guidance memos as well. Just a brief overview of what they should be covering. And then we'll go through our discussion portion. So at this point, I will hand it over to Kalina first. And Kalina is a contractor in support of NOAA, their Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and has been working on supporting responsible and equitable marine carbon dioxide removal research from a higher level for the last 2 years. She has a PhD in chemical oceanography from MIT Hui and enjoys working in the science policy engagement interface. So with that, Kalina, the screen is yours.
All right, thank you. Let's see here. Do you all see a presentation in presenter mode?
Now we do, yes.
Okay, awesome. So thank you, Fiona and Sarah, even though you aren't here live, for organizing and inviting me to be a part of it, as well as Darcy and other partners. So I'll give a very high-level overview of mCDR and its interactions with fisheries and aquaculture. We're going to try to keep this pretty brief. So there's little notes of other documents and citations that you can go into to read further if you're interested. And so this hopefully will just be like something to start the discussion with. As Fiona mentioned, I've been a contractor at NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center and have been focusing on this intersection between mCDR and fish fisheries and aquaculture. And so at the end, I'll share a little bit of those activities that we're actively working on. So to start, the reason why we're thinking about this is because carbon dioxide emissions have increased since the Industrial Revolution, and there's 182 times higher emissions today than there were in 1850. So scientific reports such as the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change have suggested that we need to consider negative emissions technologies, or the idea to remove latent carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and from historical emissions. And so in thinking about this, the ocean has entered this space because it has the ability and currently stores naturally 30% of carbon dioxide pollution that has been released since the Industrial Revolution. And so when we think about the natural pathways of the ocean, there are two main pathways where carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere. The first on the left is the inorganic pathway, where carbon dioxide is absorbed from the atmosphere and through chemical processes, and it's stored as bicarbonate, which is HCO3 minus, and that is a more stable form of carbon in the water. CO2 can outgas under certain circumstances. The second pathway is the biological carbon pump. And so this is where biology plays a large role in taking up carbon and putting it into biomass, the living being of different biological organisms. And that can then be exported from the surface to the deep, where it is stored and can be stored at longer periods of time, as noted on the right side of this figure. And it's good to note that organic carbon can also respire throughout the water column. So the biology can break down and go back into inorganic form in different areas. So naturally, the ocean is the largest reservoir of dynamic carbon, and the ocean has the potential to store 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere, and about 20 times more than both land plants and soil combined. And again, the most stable form for it to be stored in is bicarbonate. And so it has the ocean has the ability to buffer some additions of carbon dioxide within the ocean if it is done correctly and safely. And that's really where the need and the push for research is right now, is understanding how the natural method of the ocean storing carbon dioxide can be enhanced in a safe way. And so that brings us to considering marine carbon dioxide removal, or mCDR, and different techniques. And I want to note that these techniques are still at the early stages of research and understanding. So as I'm talking about the different techniques today, this research is currently being conducted, and there's also a need for a lot more to understand. So you'll notice that there's quite a few uncertainties currently. And this is also a really neat time to be talking about mCDR, because it shows that there's this opportunity for people to be involved in thinking about the research, as well as the larger scope of mCDR in an interdisciplinary way. And there's a lot of opportunities to be engaged in it currently to help co-design where mCDR is going and what we can learn about the different pathways. And so when we think about the different pathways, we can split them up between biotic approaches, or those that involve biology, on the left, and abiotic approaches are those that are more reliant on chemical processes and non-biological based on the right. And today I'm just going to talk about a few different techniques since we don't have time to go into all of it. And here we have listed macroalgae cultivation and sinking, ocean nutrient fertilization, which I'll include artificial upwelling and downwelling, ocean alkalinity enhancement, as well as electrochemical techniques such as direct ocean carbon capture and storage. And you'll notice here, this figure is from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report in 2022. This is a really good high-level report that kind of goes across all these different techniques. And something that we've been working on thinking about mCDR is this intersection with fish, fisheries, and aquaculture. So this here is a figure from a paper that a collective group, some co-authors here on the call are working on. And we are really trying to assess what potential benefits can come from enhanced engagement and interactions with fisheries and aquaculture, and then what some potential risks may be with limited interactions with fisheries and aquaculture. So I won't go into too much detail of these high level points, but as we talk about each technique, I'll then show a chart that kind of shows each technique and where currently our understanding is of potential, whether it's high potential or low potential interactions with fisheries and aquaculture. So now I'll kind of go one by one through the different techniques. And these figures here are from the NOAA research strategy, another great resource to kind of dive into overviews of the techniques. And macroalgae cultivation works by increasing the growth of macroalgae, such as aquaculture, and by having more macroalgae growth, there's photosynthesis that happens that takes up CO2 from the surface waters. This then allows the CO2 in the atmosphere to dissolve into the surface waters. This biomass then has to be removed from exposure to the atmosphere. So on the left, you can see one recommendation could be, or option could be, to sink this biomass. Or on the right, you'll see that this biomass could be processed and used for other processes for seaweed markets or other uses. On the bottom right, it shows a little box that I grabbed from the NOAA research strategy that talks about the technology readiness, estimated cost, scale of potential, and duration of storage. So how long can this be stored? And this technique hits kind of low to moderate across the board for those considerations. This is the chart I referenced where we're working on trying to understand where are we at with the knowledge of how does this interact with fisheries and aquaculture. And on these charts that I show on the top, they have listed different potential co-benefits and potential adverse impacts. The white ones are potential co-benefits, the black are potential adverse impacts, and in the middle are still things that we need to research to understand better where they kind of sit along that spectrum. And then for each type of technique that I'll show, we have these different blue boxes. And so the darker blue shows where we have less uncertainty. So again, everything's ongoing research, but this is the current understanding of kind of like high or low potential of this happening. So for macroalgae cultivation, we'll see that there's a potential for it to mitigate ocean acidification on the local short term in the shallows, but could exacerbate it at depth. And we also see that there's more certainty in thinking that there's high potential for macroalgae to provide or to impact the primary production community, fertilization of primary production, habitat alteration, spatial squeeze, taking up space in the ocean, as well as nutrient robbing, so taking nutrients for anything downstream. And it is also worthy to note for macroalgae cultivation that some of the benefits of the uses of macroalgae could outweigh the carbon storage potential. And there's unknown interactions in the deep sea with the biomass sinking. Ocean fertilization, which can include a number of different methods, including ocean iron fertilization and others, is the idea where you add nutrients to the ocean that are currently limited, and then this can increase production of mainly phytoplankton is the primary production, so the base of the food web. By increasing this photosynthesis across the base of the food web, that also takes up CO2 from the surface waters and then causes CO2 from the atmosphere to diffuse into the ocean, similar to macroalgae cultivation. And again, the biomass would then have to be removed, so the phytoplankton could sink, which is enhancing a natural process of the biological carbon pump. And again, when we look at the bottom box of, we see that this is moderate in technology readiness. There has been prior research that some of you may be aware of in the past, and that is kind of resurfacing, and people are reevaluating some of those studies to better understand the potential for this technique. It is low to moderate in terms of cost, scale, and duration of storage. When thinking about artificial upwelling, this is also a form of nutrient fertilization. You're bringing nutrient-rich waters from the deep and bringing them into the surface to introduce more nutrients to then spur the primary production. Artificial downwelling is taking CO2, or would be taking CO2 rich waters from the surface and then exporting them to the deep. And again, these are pretty low to moderate across the board, with technology readiness in particular being pretty low. When thinking about interactions with fish and fisheries, you'll notice that artificial upwelling and downwelling has a lot of uncertainty, a lot of those light blue boxes. And the few things that there's a little bit more certainty about are new infrastructure needs as well as high energy requirements. For ocean nutrient fertilization, again, there was previous research and has been for the last few decades, but there's still not strong evidence for long-term storage, carbon storage, and potential to mitigate ocean acidification in the short term at shallow, but may exacerbate it at depth. And then similar to macroalgae cultivation in terms of the different potential impacts it could have, with a few differences being increased ship traffic as well as potential for ecotoxicity. So the idea that adding nutrients to the ocean, depending on what form they're added in, could add trace metals that could then impact biology in different ways. So ocean alkalinity enhancement, we're moving a little bit more into the inorganic techniques, thinking less about the involvement, direct involvement of biology. And so OAE, there are electrochemical approaches where water or seawater can be split electrochemically into an acid and base, and then that base is added to the surface, or things like sodium hydroxide can be added to the surface waters. This process of amending water going into the ocean and increasing alkalinity is done already in wastewater treatment as well as drinking water. And so this process can align with other approaches such as shown here, like a wastewater treatment plant. And the idea is that when you add alkalinity, you increase the buffering capacity of the ocean by shifting the carbonate chemistry so that it is stored more in bicarbonate, the more stable form of carbon, and then CO2 from the atmosphere can then absorb into the surface waters. There's also an option to enhance alkalinity through addition of minerals, so things like olivine, and this has a similar idea of increasing alkalinity, and it comes from a different source. So overall, alkalinity enhancement has a low to moderate for technology readiness, estimated cost, and scale potential, but a pretty high duration of storage noted here. So it can be stored pretty stably for a long period of time, or so we think, based on current research. When we think about the interactions of fish, fisheries, and aquaculture, we see that the electrochemical and mineral techniques actually have some different certainty levels and a few differences in terms of what they may impact. So co-location potential, electrochemical methods, as I mentioned, can be co-located with existing infrastructure such as wastewater treatment plants. And then it could be higher energy requirements. For mineral methods, we think that there's a little bit more certainty that it may impact primary production and fertilization, as well as increased ship traffic, energy demand, potentially spatial squeeze depending on how it's deployed, and ecotoxicity. But we need to consider the life cycle analysis, so the idea that where do these different products come from that we're adding, and what's the overall environmental impact as well as carbon dioxide emissions associated with preparing these techniques. And we also have direct ocean carbon capture and storage. And this is the idea that seawater can be processed and the CO2 can be stripped from the seawater. And then you would end up with seawater with less CO2, which can re-enter the surface water, then allowing more absorption of CO2 from the atmosphere. And then you also have a CO2-rich stream, which is a byproduct of this technique. And that CO2-rich stream would then have to be stored some way, whether it's in geological storage, such as in the deep sea or in other bedrock, or used for other commercial uses and taken to the markets. This technique has low to moderate technology readiness, a pretty high estimated cost, and a moderate scale potential. And if using geologic storage, there's a potential for high durability. When thinking about the interactions with fish fisheries and aquaculture, a few things that we have slightly less uncertainty is the high energy requirements and also direct entrainment and potential mortality. So taking in the water in order to be processed could impact different ecosystems. And so this also has the potential to store carbon, but the life cycle analysis, again, has to be considered. And given that this would be likely stationed at a location and there's a point source of discharge, there's also unknown impacts for how that would interact with the ecosystem. So as I've mentioned throughout, there's a lot of research that's going on currently, and that also all of these techniques can benefit from more research. And so I wanted to highlight a few different ways that you can kind of look at different things that are going on and some of the ongoing field trials or pending field trials around the US. Map is from Ocean Visions. There's also a geoengineering map that shows potential projects and ongoing projects. And on Ocean Visions, there are no indicated field trials for Hawaii or Alaska. So here's a vision of the lower 48, and you can see that there's various different startups and 2 academic projects going on. Majority of them are looking at OAE in different forms, but there's also one kelp sinking and one direct ocean carbon capture and storage. So these are good resources I would encourage you to peruse if you're interested in ongoing research. And to close, I just want to update you with some of the ongoing work that I have been involved with, along with a few people on this call. We have done some work adjacent to ICES, where we've brought together researchers, scientists, people who specialize in governance, fishermen, people who work in fishery management, and talked about where mCDR can better interact with fisheries and aquaculture. And these are some of the activities that we've gone through so far. So right now we just had an in-person workshop, and we are working to prepare manuscripts for an ICES themed set. And hopefully these set of manuscripts will help kind of improve the way that mCDR interacts and overlaps with fish in fisheries and aquaculture. So keep an eye out for that, whether you want to contribute to it, a manuscript, or if you would like to read some of the products as well. The call will likely come out in the next month or so, and the deadline for submitting manuscripts will likely be early 2026. With that, feel free to reach out with any questions. Very excited to continue the webinar and hear from all the other perspectives. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Kalina. That was we gave you a tough task to give us a brief overview of all those different methods. So appreciate you tackling that one for us. Just a reminder that keep putting your questions in the chat. We're going to get to those at the end of this meeting, so hopefully everybody can stick around and we can go through all those together. Next, we will turn to Brad Warren. He leads the Global Ocean Health, a Seattle-based nonprofit organization founded in 1994. He's known for organizing multidisciplinary initiatives to strengthen leadership frontline, ocean-dependent communities to combat climate pollution, protecting their livelihoods, and the sea's ability to make dinner. So with that, I will hand it over to Brad. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see really good questions showing up in queue, so we're off to a great start. I have to say, Kalina, that was great. You did a terrific job. I'm going to get to cut a few slides here. I'll just canter right over them in the interest of time. Let me see if I can make this. There we go. Okay, is that readable for everybody? Can you see what's going on?
Slideshow might be a better view than the presenter view.
Try that.
Or maybe hit use slideshow, or never mind.
Yeah, let's try that. How's
There
that? Better.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I tend to distill the way that the ocean can suck up carbon and safely store it in two ways. You've got rocks, which is what the carbonate system feeds. It eventually turns into seafloor, and you've got algae, both micro and macro, so seaweed and plankton. The both of these, and I'll get to this point at the end, but both of these are very, very slowly renewable systems. And if we want to maintain them within a healthy envelope of conditions that can do things like support fisheries and other things we like, then we may want to start getting serious about how to manage them. Right now, we have a regulatory system that simply imposes pollution regulations on this and treats all this activity as a form of pollution. It's all we got. That's all the laws we got, and it's a mistake in a whole bunch of ways. I won't get into all the detail on that, but we're going to need to build a purpose-built framework for managing this. It's going to look in the end, we think, something like what fisheries are doing. So I'm very pleased to see ICES getting into this. And I think it's really important for fishermen to get into it because the wisdom that's been developed on the waterfront and in the fishery management community and the discourse for generations upon generations is really going to be needed for this to work right. So that said, we got a big problem. This is a mess that we should never have made. We should have done this the easy way by not making the mess. We didn't, and that's why the IPCC says we've basically cornered ourselves into cleaning up the mess. All told, there's somewhere around, people have different estimates, but somewhere around 2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide spilled into the atmosphere. It's kind of like you let the sink run for too long. At a certain point, you can't just turn off the spigot. You got to do that too. You also have to get a mop. So cleanup is now obligatory. That's kind of where we're at. So lots of legacy emissions. We'll skip through that. The two paths to the sea. You've heard this. Why the ocean? Why do people want to use the ocean? I'll go there for a minute. This big blue circle on the left is the size of the ocean carbon sink. The little red one on the right is the soil and land biomass, all the living things and plants and trees. And this tiny circle, sort of at the edge of the big blue circle, is the atmosphere. So the ocean is like 40 times bigger sink for carbon than the atmosphere, 20 times bigger than the land sink. That's why people are interested in using it. It's the big engine of the world's carbon processing system in nature. And so this, the use of this new use of the ocean for carbon to try to solve our great big spill is actually not new. What's new about it is that we're trying to get it done fast because we've made a mess fast, and we're going to have to keep up with that. The world that naturally has been doing this. This is really about can we goose it a bit and still keep it safe. So you've seen the basic projections and the detail. I'll skip through all of this. This is something that you haven't seen. There is a market paying for this work on land and a little bit at sea. It's a voluntary market. There's no regulatory, no compliance market for this now. All told, it's moving about $2 billion in contracts over the last year, most of which is pretty old-fashioned forms of carbon work. It's like grow trees and get paid for the carbon they suck up. That vast majority of it. Of the part that consists of sort of modern methods in this emerging field, the biggest part of that is also not actually new. It's biochar. Biochar is something people have been doing for thousands of years. It turns out that you can bury a lot of carbon with it. It's mostly just going underground, and it lasts various periods of time. But 100-year minimum is kind of the floor at the low end of this market for carbon removal. And many people are shooting for much more, thousands of years in the buyer side of it. So this is, just to put it in perspective, this voluntary market is so tiny that you can't regard this as anything like a solution. It's a place where proof of concept can be demonstrated. Do these things work? Can you get paid for them? Do they pencil? There's no way voluntary markets can scale to meet this problem. As far as anyone's said so far, there's no evidence for that proposition. It's reached about the $2 billion level and sort of stopped growing as far as I can see. But it's interesting, and it looks like if we're going to grow this, we're going to have to grow that to around $1 trillion, which is a big lift and involves policy. We'll get to that in discussion later, probably. Making policies that deal with the messes we've made is always controversial, and people don't like to write the check, so it may take some time. There are a bunch of mandates in the works. If you don't have a mandate, you have a voluntary market where people do this because they think it's the right thing to do, or they're trying to get ready for the future where they might have to do it. If you have mandates, it starts to look like a compliance market. It's an example of a compliance market is garbage removal. If you live anywhere except for in the remote boonies where only a tiny percentage of people live, you have to pay your monthly utility bill to haul away your sewage and your garbage. That's a compliance requirement. If you don't do it, you'll get fined at a minimum, and you'll get your utilities shut off to your house. And this is a market that has not reached that stage yet. We haven't really grown up to the reality that we're going to have to manage this waste stream, and management takes money. You got to pay people to do the work. But states are working on it. There's some local things. There's a bunch of efforts brewing. It's expected that there will be some kind of compliance market taking shape. There's already bits and pieces of it, but it's tiny and experimental at this point. Rocks, you've seen this. What's interesting here is that dot on the map with the yellow is the location of the Ebb Carbon project in Port Angeles. It's a little field study. It's not a very big project, but it's one of several up and running. You've seen this. I'll skip through this. You've heard about Ebb probably. Ebb is a University of Washington spinoff that's doing a very interesting process, essentially using photochemistry to generate and then reuse the compounds that suck up carbon out of the seawater. So it's sunlight powered. It's a very low energy process. In that way, I think it's interesting, because one of the impediments to growth of all this is the cost of the massive amount of energy most of the methods require. So Banyu is worth watching, in my opinion, because they're doing something that's sort of cheap on the energy side, and energy is a limiting factor. Seaweed and plankton, this is basically the algae side of things. There's some estimates that it could get to be pretty fair sized over the course of the decades ahead. It's not, and none of these solutions probably are, a one size fits all. Do this and you're done. But it might be a part of the portfolio of things people have to do to clean up the mess. Lots of mops, different mops. Now, you've seen this, we'll skip through this. Ocean iron fertilization is one of the options using algae. You're basically getting plankton to grow more. And if you do it right, maybe you get them to sink into places where they stay in the deep ocean. And here, I'm gonna park here for a minute and then try to leave you with some thoughts about management. Fisheries have learned the hard way how to manage marine resources. Marine resources belong to everyone. It's public trust resources. That's a global agreement. Everyone is on board with that. It means that you have to build systems that people will live with. And the folks who have to live with the most are often fishermen. You can use these two sinks. What's important about them, the biological and this sort of the alkalinity system in the ocean, is that they have been relatively stable through history, evolutionary history, and the critters we all like from the ocean are dependent on them staying within these envelopes of conditions that if you exceed those bounds, it's unclear whether you still get dinner, as an example. And the work of maintaining those is going to take many lessons that fisheries know better than anyone else. So people in this meeting and folks at ICES and at other institutions, frankly at NOAA, are really uniquely necessary to work out how to do this. And if we don't do it, we're going to wind up with systems and laws that don't fit the case and make the problem worse, in my view. 3 core ingredients of a management framework. This is old school stuff. If you've been around fisheries, you've been around this, you've probably built some of these. You need to establish the system boundaries. Where do you catch the fish? Where does the stock that you're fishing on live? The same questions have to be asked around these ocean sinks. What are the boundaries of these systems? They're not uniform. It's heterogeneous. The ocean is both in time and in space, highly variable. We're going to have to respond to that in developing systems that establish appropriate boundaries. And I'm at a meeting right now where some of the models for doing that are being talked about, and they're growing up. They're getting to where this isn't such an unreasonable thing to think about. It's still a stretch, but a lot of good work's going on. Control rules. This is where you set essentially the quantitative limits. Don't use up the ocean's alkalinity, and perhaps don't overdose it. For example, well, what's that look like quantitatively? Where are those boundaries? Somebody asked a question about oxygen, a really good question. Some of these methods will affect oxygen, both positively and negatively. And it's well worth asking what the effects on oxygen are. It's one of the parameters people will almost certainly be measuring. And I'm sure in the existing field trials, they are measuring. And that may turn out to be one of the things you want to establish the envelopes for and maintain them. Then you have this question of consent at a minimum. And the old democratic principle, consent of the governed matters. In fisheries, you could sort of put an exponent on that. It's kind of like that plus, to the 10th power or something. In ocean resource management, the same principle holds. The reason is that the people who depend on the ocean are used to looking after it. In many places, they're really used to this. And the world of marine carbon removal that's joining this conversation, it's joining a very old conversation that's learned a lot, where people have become deeply versed in what it takes to look after the ocean and deeply committed to doing it. Their livelihoods, their communities depend on it. And those fishing communities, and they're largely fishing communities, also many fishing tribes, which have rights and authorities as governments that are different from those of ordinary people and stronger in some respects. They're literally governments. So the tribes and First Nations have a very particular role here. They're more co-managers than they are users. But both have a very strong role in bringing their knowledge and the lessons that have been really learned the hard way about how to work in this system. And back to this point of consent, when you have consent, or better yet, real full bore buy-in from the people on the waterfront who depend on the ocean, you get systems that work. You get systems where you don't need a fish cop on every dock. You have your neighbor's making sure you're not breaking the rules, and vice versa. And the story of Alaska's emergence as a state was all about this. They basically said the feds are blowing it. They've overfished. They've permitted the overfishing of our salmon resource and produced the first human-induced national disaster declared by the president was the destruction of Alaska's salmon fishery in the 40s and 50s. They became a state to fix that. That's what, in fact, they made sustainable resource management Article 1 of their constitution when they became a state. Alaska is kind of the gold standard of fishery management for a reason, right? They got there the hard way, and they mean it. And they're going to mean it as they get involved in this conversation about how to use the ocean to fix the carbon problem. That has potential to benefit fisheries by protecting them from extremes in chemistry and thermal change in the ocean that mess up fisheries. It has potential to damage fisheries by violating the boundaries of the system that the ocean needs to stay in to keep producing dinner. We're going to need to get this right. And people who depend on the ocean need to be part of that solution. So that's work we're building a foundation for. We're waiting on funding from a couple of sources to begin a project doing that. And I want to open an invitation for everyone who's interested in this to get in touch with us and join in that conversation. There'll be a lot of work to harvest what people, frankly, already are pretty good at and apply it to this challenge. Thanks very much. And thanks to Kalina for covering the science so well.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. That's helpful context for what we'll be talking about for the rest of today and for many more years to come. The next part of our presentation here is on the project, and I think Fiona had planned to give that overview, but she's had to unexpectedly step out for a minute, so I'm going to share the slides that she produced here. Let me hit share. Okay, can you see my screen? Great, I have to find out where all of you are now. There we go. Okay, so this project that many of you have already been participating in is called Engaging U.S. Commercial Fishing Community to Develop Recommendations for Fishery-Sensitive mCDR Governance, Collaborative Research and Monitoring and Outreach to Fishing Communities. So the overall goal is to help raise awareness of mCDR in the fishing community and start that engagement process and form, I guess, providing guidance from the fishing community as these mCDR thoughts and projects and initiatives start to get off the ground, making sure that the fishing community is at the table. So part of this, in a minute, we'll hear about forming a fishing industry committee to advise projects, and also a set of guidance memos are going to be produced based on a set of roundtables that happen. And I'll have Fiona's got a slide here in a minute that shows the timeline of the project, and we'll be talking about these guidance memos during the next section. So project objectives here: build networks with the science and mCDR community, and then engage the regional fisheries management councils. There is process and timeline here. So this project started in the spring. There were 17 roundtable discussions that were facilitated by Sarah Schumann that I think many people on this call participated in. They were heavily discussion based. Sarah produced a 42-minute overview video of mCDR that participants watched first to kind of wrap their mind around, like, what is this topic? And the different approaches. And so those roundtables could really focus on discussion. A lot of really stimulating thoughts and ideas and suggestions came out of those. And then this summer, the project team is going through what we learned through those conversations and is producing some draft memos, guidance memos on 3 topics. And then there will be a thought leadership forum, which will be recruited from the fishing community to help review those memos, make edits, get more input where needed, and then finalize them. And then this winter, they will be disseminated. We wanted to just share a couple of some of the prompts. Sarah did a great job of coming up with some very I guess, substantive questions and detailed questions that fishermen engaged in on the many facets of this topic. Some of them included: what are the characteristics of responsible mCDR from a fisheries standpoint? How should the findings from mCDR research be communicated to stakeholders in accessible and understandable ways? Are there any spatial tools or approaches that you would recommend for planning mCDR research and deployment, or any tools that you would not recommend? At what stage in the mCDR research project planning should project leads begin engaging with the fishing community? And what is the right balance between offering affected communities a voice from the start versus burdening them with participation fatigue before a project is even sure to happen. This is a subset of probably 50 questions that many of you tackled during these sessions. And so I think, yep, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and we're going to pivot to, let's see, stop share. Oops. I think that did it. Sorry, there's now some construction noise in the background. Hopefully that's not coming through. We're next going to pivot to a panel that includes some of the fishermen that took part in these roundtables. So this is a chance for all of us to hear from them about some of their reflections from the discussions. And then a little later on the agenda, we'll open it up for reflections from additional webinar participants. But we're going to start off with Shaye, Rooney, Bruce Steele, Antonio Armina, and Katie Almeida. And so Shaye, Bruce, Antonio, and Katie, if you're able to turn your cameras on, if you have that capability, that would be great. And each of them will have 3 minutes to reflect on the question of, in your view, what single action is most urgently needed to ensure that any future mCDR research and development is responsible and fisheries sensitive? And we'll start with Shaye, and I'll just briefly introduce Shaye. She is the co-director of the Commercial Fisheries Center of Rhode Island, where she organizes the commercial fisherman apprenticeship training, coordinates a seafood donation program, and represents the Rhode Island fishing community in the process of offshore wind development. So, Shaye, thank you for speaking today.
Thank you, Darcy, for the introduction. So a key takeaway for me as a participant in the roundtables was that we're in these very early stages of mCDR technologies, and it's going to be critical to involve the fishing community in the planning process as early and as often as possible. So each of these technologies, they're very different. They each come with their own concerns and their own potential impacts to the ecosystem and to fishing. So the pathways, they're still very much unknown to the majority of the industry. And I think efforts to raise awareness and educate members of the fishing industry about these technologies and to gather industry input like this project through the Fishing Friendly Climate Action Campaign and RODA are key first steps. And I think this educational component is really necessary prior to development of any type of policy framework so that the fishing industry can properly engage in the process. So the roundtable certainly helped deepen my understanding in thinking about the different needs for responsible mCDR projects. But I still feel that my understanding is at like the surface level. I think there's a lot more learning to be done about these different pathways and about what these could actually look like in practice. I think it's going to be critical for industry to engage and provide input on things like siting of these projects, so the timing, research priorities, and also potential mitigation measures if that might be needed down the road. I think it's also going to be ideal if a guide to best practices for all these aspects could be developed through an industry-led initiative, very much like this. So kudos to all of the project team. This is a great initiative. I also think it's clear that further research and funding for research is a necessary next step, just to understand what those potential impacts might be to both fishing and to the ecosystem. There are definitely still a lot of unknowns and questions to be considered and addressed before any projects should be able to move forward. And I'm just going to give like a really quick kind of overview about a project taking place in our region. So there is a project taking place in our region called, it's an ocean alkalinity enhancement project. It's this pilot project, but it's led by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and it's called Loch Ness, which stands for Locking Away Ocean Carbon in the Northeast Shelf and Slope. So I attended one of the meetings that the researchers had held to, again, engage the commercial fishing community. And fishermen came, they expressed some concern with the project, and the researchers did listen, and they were able to adjust some aspects of the project, such as the timing and location. But through that, it's clear that the fishing industry had a lot of interest in engaging. but also that there's definitely this educational gap, and definitely a need for more education efforts so that fishermen can properly engage in this effort.
Thanks so much, Shaye, for those reflections and highlighting some of those salient points and needs. And I also just want to mention, you mentioned the Loch Ness project. I know Adam Subis from that project is on the call and has mentioned he has some experience with the permitting structure. If later in the call we want to go into that in some of the Q&A. So thank you, Shaye. Next, we'll move to Bruce Steele, who is based in Buellton, California. He's harvested sea urchins, abalone, salmon, herring, and roe on kelp. And Bruce has served on the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council and the board of the California Coastal Ocean Acidification Network. So we'll get to hear from Bruce next.
Yeah, hi. I guess I've been at this for about 20 years now. I kind of want to start. I mean, it's great to kind of see how much we need to know, I guess, as far as fishermen and the meetings. I mean, we really, fishermen don't have the expertise to make decisions on a lot of this stuff. I mean, each project, you'd have to have knowledge about ocean processes for deep water or intermediate water, or there's just a huge amount of knowledge it takes to really be up to speed on this. So yes, in education is important. I think you're going to really have to try hard to find individual fishermen who have a lot of expertise, at least in some sort of narrow focus, whether that be kelp or interaction with the green sand projects or any of these projects, you know, that I think we'd be well served by having expert fishermen to deal with us rather than think that we can go out and canvass the general fishing public. And then just in general, the whole subject, right now we're at 1.5 degrees Celsius heating. That was supposed to be something we don't pass. And we already went through it 1 year. We're at close to 4 parts per million right now of additional CO2. So the rate of increase is going up. Our natural sinks, our terrestrial sinks are beginning to break down. The boreal forest burning, the Amazon burning. I mean, we are losing natural sinks while we're trying to figure out how we're going to goose sinks that we really don't have a whole lot of control over. So it's not that I'm opposed to this stuff, but I think if you're going to do it and go through the energy and effort, you should put the carbon into long-term sinks. The whole idea of supporting kelp, which is maybe 10 years, I think it's much less than that, is preposterous. So if we're going to concentrate on something, we should concentrate on things that have a chance of making a noticeable difference without a whole lot of biological downsides. And so alkalinity enhancement happens to be my favorite one, because as you increase alkalinity, it changes the omega, which is the point where aragonite dissolves. So anyhow, it's getting a little deep, but I have my favorites, but ultimately they should be projects that don't harm existing fisheries, and then also have the potential for a substantial amount of benefit. And I'll kind of leave it there.
Great. Thank you, Bruce, for those comments. Also, I think many of the points that you brought up were echoed in multiple roundtable sessions as well. Our next speaker will be Antonio Arena, who gill nets for salmon in Bristol Bay, Alaska, on the vessel Caribbean Sun. And in winters, he operates a charter fishing operation in the Virgin Islands. So Antonio, you are next.
Hi. Quick little correction on my bio. The chartering I do in the Virgin Islands isn't fishing. I do tours down there. But still very involved with fisheries down there and up here in Alaska. A little bit more about myself. I've been fishing in Alaska for about 18 years. I'm currently working in the salmon fishery in Bristol Bay. I've also done king crab, barredeye, cod in Alaska in previous years. I've commercially fished Dungeness crab in Washington. I do work in charters in the Virgin Islands in the winter, where I do tours around the U.S. Virgin Islands and British Virgin Islands. And I've also done stuff out in Hawaii on whale watching boats, dolphin sightseeing boats, tugboats, things like that. Through all of these different areas and industries that I've worked, I've talked a good bit with biologists from the University of the Virgin Islands and the Virgin Islands National Park about the effects of climate change on the reefs down there, and spend a considerable amount of time in and under the water and have seen a lot of those effects firsthand. They've affected the tourism industry down there, as well as the charter and commercial fishing industry. And I've been in 3 Category 5 hurricanes in the Virgin Islands, one of which was Hurricane Irma in 2017. It was one of the largest and strongest hurricanes in recorded history, with gusts of over 283 miles an hour. Hurricanes are getting bigger, they're getting more frequent. I've talked with a lot of the biologists up here in Alaska about how the increased water temperatures are affecting salmon and different marine life. So I agree that climate change is definitely an issue, and it needs a solution, because fishermen are experiencing these effects of climate change in huge ways. And we've got a lot to lose. And we have a lot to lose if climate change continues, but we also have a lot to lose if the solutions to climate change cause damage. And damage can be done in a lot of different ways, including in the research process. And fishermen need to be involved in this research process, to give up-to-date local knowledge on the marine environments that are currently in the future going to be used for mCDR. I spend about, give or take, 200 days a year on the water, in the water, underwater. And when I talk to my peers around the country, nobody knows about mCDRs. I've yet to have a discussion with anybody in the fishing industry that I collaborate with, or the charter industries from the Virgin Islands to Alaska to Hawaii and across, and nobody's heard of it. Which, I hadn't heard about it until I started getting involved with Sarah Schumann and getting emails and stuff from her. And when I first heard about it, it didn't make sense to me. The thought of meddling with the chemistry of the ocean, meddling with the biology of the ocean, it didn't make sense. And to a large degree, it still doesn't. But to answer the question of what action is currently needed, I think that outreach and education is definitely the biggest thing. Helping people understand what's going on, not only with climate change, but what these proposed solutions are, is definitely one of the biggest things that needs to be done at this point, so that fishermen can be involved and work along with the well-meaning efforts, so that the plans are better laid out from the start. Fishermen, fishing communities, working waterfronts, we can all be a huge assistance and a benefit to mCDR, to ensure that both the success of carbon capture and the longevity of a healthy marine environment are on the forefront. A lot of these solutions got fast-tracked in the beginning, and they kind of got rolled into a green energy solution, and there's millions of dollars in funding that got pumped into this. And I feel like a lot of it got moved along pretty fast, as far as the fishing industry perspective is concerned. And a lot of the conversations that I've been involved in the roundtable discussions and stuff like that reference a lot about how it's still very much in the early stages, which I understand, and the big picture of what's going on, that it is still in the early stages. But as far as what I know of, and my peers in the fishing industry know of, it's pretty far along to just be hearing about it. The idea that these things are already being tested in certain areas, and it's not just an idea or a concept, like that means that there is the potential for negative impacts in what's currently happening. Climate change needs a solution. That's something that everybody I talk with agrees upon. But we can't fall for the idea that there's an easy or singular solution to this. I don't think that it's going to fall on one method of mCDR or another to be a solution. It's going to be a collaboration of a lot of different things. And because it's going to be a number of different things in a number of different areas, fishermen across the country need to be involved, and they need to have a seat at the table. Fishermen have been working on the water and working with nature for hundreds of years, and we have a lot of stake in the game. I'm 41 years old, and I hope to be fishing for the next 25 or 30 years, which means that when I get to the end of my career, I'm going to be facing the repercussions of either climate change or the failure of a solution. So I'm personally very invested in seeing something like this work. But it has to be done properly, and it has to be done the right way. Something that I would definitely like to see as things develop is an outline to identify and define the acceptable limits of damage to the environment. Not only the environment, but the ecosystem of the affected areas, the industries in that areas, not just the fishing industry, but a lot of the support industries too, and the communities, and how an effect from one area can affect a different area downstream. Everything in the ocean's moving. So if you do a research project in one area and there's negative effects, it's not just affecting that one area. It's going to catch in the currents, and it's going to end up somewhere else and affect that area as well. So outlining what the acceptable limits are for these different research projects, at what point they're going to decide, okay, hey, this didn't work and we need to stop, what those parameters are, and who's setting those parameters, and who's quantifying those parameters. These are all things that I, as a fisherman, want to know. And not only if these things are happening in my community or around my community, but anywhere in the ocean, because it's all connected. As the technology improves for things like this, and we uncover new innovative ways for solutions to climate change, the ability to do damage also increase, and the cost of doing this grows exponentially. Being a green solution does not exempt these techniques from the due process and research that needs to happen to make sure that it's done properly. Thank you.
Thanks, Antonio.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're highlighting some major points here, including the need for awareness in the fishing community with this quickly moving issue, and then also a lot of touch points in which fishermen's engagement is going to be really important. Our last panelist is Katie Almeida, who is a Senior Representation, Government Relations, and Sustainability Specialist at the Town Dock in Narragansett, Rhode Island. She tracks fisheries management changes for the Town Dock, sits on various fishery advisory panels, and is a board member of RODA. So Katie, if you could reflect for a couple minutes, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, everyone gave excellent answers already, and coming up last, I don't want to repeat all of them, but I definitely think everyone hit on some really important points and made some good suggestions. I will, at least from my perspective, I had a lot of experience with offshore wind when offshore wind first started coming around about 8 years ago into the ports, specifically in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So I would say that this up and coming industry can really learn from the offshore wind experience with their outreach, lack of outreach, working with, lack of working with the fishing industry, and learn from those mistakes and not make the same ones, in hopes to have a better relationship with the industry. With that, I would say that it needs to start yesterday. I first heard about this project, I think it was in the fall or last summer, and unfortunately I wasn't able to make it to the public meeting, the public hearing that was in Rhode Island that Shaye mentioned, which I know was a bummer for me, because I really need to put this on my radar, because it seems to be the next up and coming industry. So I think the industry needs to be at the table from the beginning in order to have participation, have a say in how this is rolled out, but also having a seat at the table and having this industry listening to the fishing industry. I also think we need a way to track that the industry's information is being received and implemented, because we just didn't have that with offshore wind. I also think that, and it seems to be going this way, at least on the East Coast, I can't say in any other region, that we need to start small with this. We need to start small, research the effects that we're seeing. First of all, does it even work? Second of all, what are the effects, biological, ecological, and then go from there. I hate to see a trade-off. And that's what I often felt with offshore wind is, we're trading one industry for another. And now it seems that we have another industry coming up behind offshore wind, and we could potentially seeing, that same pathway being followed. I also agree that it's not going to be one solution that's going to solve this problem. It's going to be a few different solutions that we're going to have to use and depend on. And that includes, which is unfortunate because I don't feel like we concentrate enough on this, our own behavior of reducing our consumption. And I just feel like oftentimes that's kind of left last, and the environment takes the brunt of things, because it's easier to control than it is to say, hey, I don't think you need that a second toy or something like that. It's tough. But education is going to be huge, and education is going to be needed both with the public and the fishing industry. And we saw some conflicts with that with offshore wind. And like I said, there's a lot to learn from that process. So I hope this new industry can take that and run with it and learn from that. But as for outreach for the industry, you have quite a few of us, at least on the panel so far, and you have some people who are not on the panel that be more than willing to help you with how to reach out to those groups and how to reach the masses the best. No one way is going to be, the way to do it, for instance, not one mailing list, because everyone's on different ones. But one good one is, maybe to go through the councils, get on their mailing list, the states on their mailing list. But people need to be involved soon, and especially before these, bigger projects get rolled out.
Thank you so much, Katie. As you'll see in some of the take-homes from the roundtables here, these are key points that were raised multiple times that I think there's a lot of support behind. So thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to next share more about what was covered during the roundtable conversations, and then next steps for writing them into guidance memos. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. How is that? Great. Okay. So the roundtables were broken into 4 modules, and there was about an hour discussion on each one. So really getting into some details. The first one was on core principles of fisheries-sensitive mCDR. So these discussions were about what constitutes responsible versus irresponsible mCDR, how to balance the risks of action versus inaction to the increased carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and and also how participants felt about the different approaches to mCDR and which ones they would prioritize for further research or not. Participants talked about when and who should decide when a project needs to be stopped, and also what scaling up could look like. The next module was co-production of knowledge. So this looked into what specialized knowledge fishermen hold that could be applied to this field, and also how fishermen wanted to be involved in collecting the data. So it also looked at what role they wanted in research planning and what would make sense for managing and sharing data. The next one was on governance. So these conversations were about where mCDR projects should be cited, and also the process that should be used to try to figure that out. Also how the benefits from mCDR could be shared and how co-benefits for fishermen could be maximized. The groups also discussed how to mitigate harmful impacts and also what happened if there were harmful impacts, and then additionally how mCDR could be financed in ways that felt trusted and safe for fishermen. And then the last one was on stakeholder engagement. So this looked at when and how fishermen wanted to be engaged in the process. Were there ways to avoid power imbalances? Who should be involved, both from the research side and the fishing community side? And then also the role of third parties that could be used to provide integrity and trust in the process. So here's a few overall take-homes. These are at the 30,000 foot level. The big take-home that we heard from all the roundtables and our speakers today was that fishermen want to be involved, and they want to be involved early and often. More engagement is better, and the trust-building component of this process is really important. And there were a lot of examples that came up, particularly with offshore wind, where trust was not built. Participants also cited that co-production is a way to build trust, and we'll get more into that in just a minute. The groups identified a lot of different types of fishermen's knowledge that would be important for any type of mCDR field trial or project to be successful. And then also an important thing to mention here is that throughout these roundtables, there was a very wide spectrum of views represented. The fishing community is numerous communities, and sometimes opposite suggestions or opinions came up, and this really underscores the importance of wide-scale participation on these projects. There were levels of comfortability with certain ideas and approaches that were held by some members that were not held by others, and that makes sense. We're still in the process of working through the recommendations from the roundtables. There was a lot of content that came out during these sessions, so I'm going to just provide a couple of short examples here. This slide is on co-production. So for the co-production process, there was wide agreement, as we've said, that it is never too early to involve fishermen, and that they would like to be advisors and decision makers, not just consulted once, but really incorporated into any projects involved in planning, field testing, or development, and that they would like to have a role in setting project goals and also make sure that there are co-benefits for fishermen. So not just enduring this activity happening on their waters, but really looking to establish positive outcomes for their fishery during this process. One of the conversation topics was about research hubs, which would involve multiple entities working together to try to look at ways to design and implement field trials, and the fishermen wanted to be part of these hubs. It was also noted multiple times back to the issue of trust that it is helpful when fishermen speak to other fishermen and having fishermen in the role of the decision makers or spokespeople, or that facilitators are chosen who are trusted and approved by the fishing community. I'm going to share a couple of quotes from this topic. One is, fishermen must be allowed the opportunity to understand what all this is. No one should be expected to advocate for themselves without the knowledge of how it will impact them positively or negatively. And that shouldn't be done by some mCDR expert through a big presentation. It should be done like this, through intermediaries who are trusted within the community in small groups. First, educate properly. Then offer multiple opportunities for feedback as projects get cited. That saves people hurt and money. The planning process is annoying and long, but that's the cost of doing things right. And then another quote is, the key to engaging fishermen is having a fisherman speak to other fishermen and having the researchers there to answer questions. If someone comes down the dock and doesn't even know how to walk the dock down the dock, it's hard to establish rapport. And then this is the last slide of examples for co-production. And again, this is like tip of the iceberg of the information gathered during these roundtables. But in order for collaboration on mCDR projects to be consistent and effective and on good terms, it needs to be easy and beneficial to the fishermen. And a big part of that is making sure that they are compensated, not just for the data collection, but also for time spent in planning meetings. The fishermen in the roundtables also had a lot of ideas on what their role could look like for data collection through phone apps or radio calls, thinking of ways to minimize time taken away from fishing. It was noted that a lost day on the water could be thousands of dollars, so we need to make this easy and streamlined for data collection if they're contributing to data collection. And there were a lot of examples pointed to from other projects and collaborations, some of which were good and some of which were bad. There were a lot of examples that came up about FEK, the types of fishermen's ecological knowledge that they could provide. Some samples are on this slide. And then I'll read these two quotes. There is nothing more frustrating than having fishermen's input dismissed as anecdotal. And another is modeling is based on data. A lot of times it fails utterly to reflect what the actual situation is. That's where fishermen's observations and fleshing out the weak spots in the data is really important. So we'll be taking the information collected during these 17 roundtables, and we'll be producing 3 guidance memos on the topics shown here. So engaging commercial fishermen as co-producers of information, elements of effective governance for fisheries-sensitive mCDR development. So this includes planning and permitting, and then effective engagement of the fishing community in the CDR context. These will be multiple pages each, and these memos are designed to help those involved in mCDR, so researchers, developers, permitting agencies, and others, to engage with members of the fishing community in appropriate and effective ways and on the terms of the fishing community. So these will be drafted this summer with these writing teams based on the information from the roundtables, and then refined in the fall under the guidance of the Thought Leadership Forum, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and then they will be circulated in the winter. So I'm going to hand it off next to Fiona, who's going to share a video about the Thought Leadership Forum and how to join.
Thank you, and thank you, Darcy, for covering those slides earlier. I had the joy of dealing with the most inconsistent school bus ever, so I appreciate the help. So next, Sarah could not be here in person, but she's somewhat here in spirit. She filmed a video to tell everybody all about the kind of next phase of our project, which is the Thought Leadership Forum, and they will, any volunteers for that forum will play a key role in helping us refine our guidance memos, as Darcy covered earlier. So I will go ahead and share Sarah's video. If there's anything wrong with the audio, just let me know and I can try to fix it. But here we go.
Hi, my name is Sarah Schumann. I want to spend a couple of minutes inviting those of you who are members of the fishing industry to apply to join the Commercial Fisheries Thought Leadership Forum on mCDR. So the Thought Leadership Forum on mCDR is something that this project is going to convene starting this fall. We're seeking up to 12 fishing industry members for this group. Those members can be fishermen, shoreside members of the seafood industry, fishery representatives of staff. We are focusing on Alaska, the West Coast, and the Northeast, because that is the scope of our project, and that is where we, the project team, have the deepest networks in the fishing industry. However, we would be willing to entertain applications from beyond that geographic area. And we're hoping for a real diversity of perspectives. So everyone from, young to old, shoreside to vessels, small fleet to large fleet. And we do want to make sure that we're including at least one person who is affiliated with tribal or indigenous fisheries, because it is becoming clear that the fishing community and the indigenous community are two of the most critical stakeholder communities to engage on the issue of mCDR, and we feel it's very important to be starting to build some bridges between those communities so that we can find strength together. The term of service for the Thought Leadership Forum on mCDR is from this September to next February. but there's an option to keep it going if folks are interested in doing that. This would be after the end of the grant, so I can't promise that we would be able to offer stipends as we will for that initial term of service, but I think it's very much needed to have a strong fishing industry voice on these issues. And I'm not suggesting that this group would sort of engage in advocacy per se, but to be sort of an initial repository of expertise within the fishing industry that can respond when there is a call for input on sort of high level mCDR strategy. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean there in a few minutes. But the immediate objectives between September and February of this Thought Leadership Forum are to act as a sounding board to complete our set of 3 guidance memos. Those are the guidance memos that Fiona, Darcy, Alex, and Austin are going to be producing over the summer, are going to be drafting over the summer, related to fishery-sensitive mCDR governance, best practices for engaging the fishing community in mCDR planning and decision-making, and involvement of the fishing community as co-producers of knowledge in an mCDR context. This role would involve reading and reviewing the drafts that those 4 memo writers produce, and working with them on a dissemination strategy for when those guidance memos are complete. You would also be working with me directly to advise me on efforts to raise awareness and literacy on mCDR among the broader fishing industry, so that we're making sure that all of our peers in the industry are brought along with us in terms of gaining a basic understanding of what the mCDR techniques are and how they could affect us. And lastly, we may interface with third-party strategy processes as opportunities arise where a fishing industry perspective is needed. And I'm going to take you on a brief tour through a few of those third-party strategy processes that are underway right now, where efforts like ours could be integrated or could be useful. So many of those strategies are led by the nonprofit Ocean Visions, which is a leader in the mCDR space. They are wrapping up a project called Building a Collective Strategy to Advance mCDR R&D for Climate Relevant Solutions, where their goal is to enable mCDR deployment decision-making by 2030. Another effort led by Ocean Visions focuses on phytoplankton carbon solutions and understanding, what kind of research priorities should be in place in order to answer fundamental questions about this particular mCDR pathway. Ocean Visions is also hosting a project on environmental impact assessment framework for mCDR. And beyond Ocean Visions, there are other entities who are also leading in this space. For example, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine are convening a steering committee to create an update of their research strategy for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal and sequestration. And in the fall, the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University is going to be hosting a Sea Grant Symposium on mCDR law, policy, and governance. So those are just a few of the opportunities that the fishing industry could have a voice in. Currently, I have been interfacing with all of these efforts as an individual, but that is not ideal. As you know, the fishing community is a community. It's broad, it's diverse, and we need to make sure that all voices and perspectives and areas of expertise are taken into account when we're formulating our, what kinds of input we integrate into opportunities like this. So I don't want to do it alone. I want you to share in this role with me, which is why I'm asking you to consider joining the Thought Leadership Forum on mCDR. This is a QR code where you can apply. We've left the deadline open until August 15th, so you have plenty of time to think about it during your fishing seasons. Come back and decide whether this is right for you. You can also reach out to me at fisheryfriendlyclimateaction@gmail.com. Hope to see your application soon, and thank you for considering this important role.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so our next step, or next item on the agenda is our Q&A. And we are running a little late on our if only I could speak the English language today. Sorry, I'm struggling. We're running a little bit behind on our agenda. So I was going to start with some of the questions in the chat. And I noticed that Kalina was kind enough. Thank you, Paul. We will. I'll look into that. Might have to. Thank you, Darcy. Um, Hopefully that will work. Uh, Paul noted that the QR code was expired, so I will have to follow up on that one. Um, but Kalina was kind enough to start responding to some of the questions in the chat, so I don't know whether Bruce, Steele, or Frank, you might have any follow-ups, or were those responses sufficient? And you don't have to, if you stay silent, I'll assume that it's a yes.
Well, I had a couple questions, but one of them was a question on the sinking of shelves which is a long-term sink. I just was interested why it hasn't gotten any farther as far as a consideration for a way to sink carbon. But I think importantly, the other thing I said is I was involved clear back when aquaculture oyster industry was crashing in the Northwest, and it was kind of a discovery project, and then figuring out what kind of instrumentation to use, ultimately then how to manage the water to solve the problem. But because of the history of that, I really think aquaculture has to be on this conversation. They have experience with what's going on. They can show you experimentally what happens when you change seawater, what the biological effects are. They have labs set up, everything's there. And they really, really need to be in on this conversation.
Thank you. As I said, I think Kalina tried to get at the first part of your question about the shells as a carbon storage method. Kalina, I don't know if you wanted to elaborate more on that, or if that's sufficient.
Yeah, I can say some things. I actually haven't dove too much into all the literature on this technique, but I would say that there's probably considerations on scalability of it, and also what I've been sharing is kind of like the leading techniques that the community overall is considering. So there's a lot of variations of these techniques. It's not to say that these are the only techniques, and within them there are many different ways to accomplish these goals. But it is important to think about the overall, I guess, techniques are being considered if they have potential to scale, and in addition to the ability to safely, responsibly move carbon, and the potential of the co-benefits and impacts on the environment. So I am not an expert on that technique, but from the little bit I've read, it looks like some people are looking at it to see how viable it is.
So could I respond that basically when you do ocean, first ocean fertilization projects are to enhance phytoplankton. Phytoplankton form aragonite or calcium carbonate shells. They sink to the bottom of the ocean. So effectively, when you're talking about ocean fertilization, you're really utilizing the calcite and the aragonite to sink the organisms into the deep ocean. So as far as scale, it has probably, as good a scale as any other thing to look into. And again, to reiterate, the whole point is to sink carbon as long as we can get it to go away. And the deep ocean is probably not the best answer. I really think the shelves are a better answer. I mean, literally millions of years you can store carbon tectonically from the shelves. So we should don't write off things that are already out there working. Anyhow, I said that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I
you.
would agree that it can be if you consider the diatom, or I mean not diatoms because they're silicious, but like other phytoplankton species that build calcium carbonate, and some others where I was going with that are considering mollusks and things like that is where I've seen some preliminary research. So yeah, thanks Bruce for sharing.
Thank you. I think our next question in the chat was from Erica Fuller, and I'm not sure we have any permitting experts on the call, but she was wondering if anybody could elaborate on the permitting regimes for the various methods. And that's not something that I have any expertise on. So if anybody on the call does, feel free to.
I can do a short response to that.
Thank you.
She may know more than I on this, but EPA manages permitting for the offshore under the Marine Protected Areas, Sanctuaries and Research Act, which is essentially is the U.S. instrument for implementing the anti-dumping convention. It treats it as ocean dumping. Whatever you're putting in the water, you're dumping. It's not viewed as a constructive activity like fishing. It's viewed as harmful inherently. The same is true along the coast where it's you need a permit under the Clean Water Act, a pollution discharge permit. And at this point, both kinds of permits have been issued. People are doing field trials under them. The problem with this regime in the long term is kind of twofold. One, it's designed to stifle this activity in its crib. If we turn out to need it at scale, this is no way to run it. It's essentially illegal to commercialize this activity, particularly in the offshore realm. And that's reflected in the London Convention and Protocol as well. It's quite a the system, the policies we have in place are quite useful for controlling kind of wicked bad actors, but not really so useful for managing the sustainable use of ocean biogeochemical resources and biological resources. It's a new challenge. The laws weren't built for that. So that gets to the second part. If the effect of the laws is to do what amounts to stifling it in its crib and imposing a regulatory regime that doesn't fit, you get a very predictable response. This has been well documented in other fields, including economic development in the poor world, where clumsy and ill-fitted regulation produces corruption and a kind of black market economy. For an activity that turns out to potentially to be very important, and this could be one of those, I'm not sure you really want to be squeezing it into a black market. There's already some kind of questionable money going into parts of this, and from parts of the world that are not signatory to those international conventions. And the effect of this at this stage is modest, but essentially, if the world says, "Screw your regulatory thing, you Boy Scouts, we're going out there and doing this on our own," we're not going to get a world we like out of that. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I will just note that we have technically reached time on this webinar, but I think the project team is willing to stay on for longer. If anybody's interested, we'll keep going for a little bit more. Okay, and I think I missed Antonio. I think you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, there was a question posed to me, I think maybe while I was talking, asking when I first heard about mCDRs from Paul Morris. I first heard about it this past fall from an email that Sarah had put out. And that was the first I'd ever heard about it. And admittedly, my reaction was not the greatest when I started looking into it, because a lot of these techniques, without looking into the details of how they work, sound absolutely absurd to me. Through the process, I've learned a lot more about it and wrap my mind around the fact that I need to educate myself better about how they work and how they're going to affect the environment before I form too many opinions. But I've seen the same reaction out of most people that I've talked to, that initial reaction is that this must be a joke. There's no way that anybody would ever consider doing these things, dumping chemicals into the ocean. That's just, no, why would they ever do that? or messing with the biology or the chemistry of the ocean. Like that all sounds like a horrible idea. I'm still wanting some more information to wrap my mind around forming a solid opinion on whether these are good ideas or bad ideas, but that initial gut reaction from myself and from many of the people that I've talked to was 100% negative. As far as how to raise awareness and get the word out to fishermen, there's a lot of different ways you could do it. There's a lot of fisherman forums. There's a lot of fishing conventions and expos. Fish Expo in Seattle is a huge one. The Boston Fish Expo on the East Coast is a huge one. You could set up booths and tables and get information out that way. There's things like National Fishermen. Sarah had an article put out just a few days ago. That's a great resource to get information out to fishermen. There's publications, and then there's all of the dozens and dozens and dozens of fish organizations and groups and committees around the country, along with fish processing companies. They have access to hundreds, if not thousands, of fishermen that are in their network. So there's a few different ways that you can do it. Something else I'd like to touch on that I haven't seen in anybody's presentation so far, and I talked a little bit about this in some of the panels that I've been on previously, is market perception. As fishermen, the fisheries market is one of the biggest hurdles that we deal with, along with catching the fish, we got to sell it, and how much money we can sell it for. And market perception is very, very fickle, and it's not always based on fact. And I've kind of come up with this theoretical situation in my head to explain this, and I'll use Bristol Bay as an example. In theory, if you use ocean alkalinity and you dump chemicals in the ocean to change the pH, and it works amazingly well, and you single-handedly cure climate change with ocean alkalinity, and you never hurt a single marine organism throughout the entire process, and you put out a report raving about the success of how you have cured climate change and never hurt a single marine organism by dumping all these chemicals in the ocean in Bristol Bay. All the market's going to hear is that you dumped chemicals in the ocean in Bristol Bay, and that's where their salmon comes from, and they don't want to buy salmon from Bristol Bay anymore because it's got chemicals on it. And you will completely crash the entire salmon market for Bristol Bay. You never hurt a single salmon in that process, but the market perception is those fish have chemicals on them and I don't want to buy them anymore. So, and that's an extreme example. I understand that, but that market perception and what's put out to the public can be damaged even by promoting positive and good information out there. And that's something that needs to be very carefully handled and kept an eye on as we move through these processes and stuff starts being tested. Even if you're not hurting the fish, you can severely hurt the market.
Thank you. There was one more question for one of our other panelists, Katie. If Katie is still available, and it was in response to a comment, Katie, that you'd made from your experiences with offshore wind about trading one industry for another. And what would you want to the mCDR field and its interactions with fisheries to look like?
I think in terms of that, I think it goes back to my comment on research first and to see if there are any negative effects on the fisheries and ecosystems. And then let's just say you run the research, it's proven to be, say, let's just harmless or negligible effects. And then, okay, we're going to start planning these projects in certain parts of the ocean. And then at that point, then it's working with the fishing industry to narrow down areas that won't work, might work, and definitely could work. So therefore, you aren't displacing the fishing industry off historical fishing grounds.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a question for, well, the project team has a question for any mCDR project people, researchers, anybody who kind of works in permitting, um, and still on this call, how might you um, use the kind of our outputs from this meeting? Um, we're developing guidance memos. Hopefully, those would be useful for everybody. But is there anything specific that you all might be able to share about kind of the information that you would need, or how you could use any information provided on kind of the side of the fishing industry? Any takers?
I can respond to that, if that's okay. So my name's Jenny Ruvan. I'm at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I think the outputs that are being described as part of your project sound incredible and really, really valuable. So I know the mCDR research community has struggled with a lot of those same questions. When is it appropriate to reach out to people to engage? At what stage of a project, particularly for research projects that are short in duration and grant funded. They may or may not, have support initially. Is it appropriate to reach out to involve people at the very, very early planning stages when there may not even be a project that gets supported? Those are the kinds of questions that are actively being discussed within the research community. So to me, it sounds like the products that you guys are developing as part of this work will be very, very valuable and can help guide the development of future research plans, future project planning, etc. I also think sort of the group that you have pulled together, both in this call and the panel, as well as it sounds like what is going to be pulled together through, Sarah's work and your project work going forward, could be a really valuable resource to talk to individual researchers or other project developers as part of their work. The fishing community is at the front line here, and I think this is a really critical piece. So I think it will be very well received within the community.
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in?
I'll say one more thing too, Fiona, about some of the comments you made about trust. Trust is going to be a big hurdle with fishermen, and I'll speak for myself on this one. That I definitely have a lot of trust issues when it comes to research and to science. I've seen different things, different research projects get swayed one direction or another to suit the person that's funding the research. And w- all due respect to researchers, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to anybody, but um, when you've got opposing sides of a certain issue, and they're both doing their own research, and that research comes out completely different on this side versus this side, one of them's being pushed one direction and one of them's being pushed another, which for me personally causes a lot of trust issues when it comes to stuff like that. And education and educating myself on those issues is a big element of that, to know what parts of it to trust and what parts of it not to. But that's going to be a big hurdle with a lot of fishermen as these things move forward and the research information starts coming out, is whether people are going to trust those numbers, they're going to trust the data, they're going to trust the research or not. Um, so outreach and education are gonna play a huge role in getting fishermen's trust as this information starts coming out more and more, and the testing starts coming out more and more. Um, but yeah, I know you'd kind of brought that up a few times in your presentation.
Thank you. That's an important point. Um, I will ask. Oh, go ahead, Kalina.
I was going to say briefly to respond to your question, Fiona. I am not actively involved in a project, and in my position, I kind of look across a lot of different mCDR research and think about this interdisciplinary intersection, specifically with fisheries and aquaculture. And I think that the work that this project is doing is really critical, and I think even having this network of fishermen to talk to and to hear from for scientists and other practitioners is really vital. And I think I'm in, a certain subset of conversations where we really want to have more co-design, more co-development, to listen to fishermen, and it goes both ways to have people from more the science oriented area want to engage, and also to have people from the fishery perspective to also want to engage. So I think that you guys are playing a really important role bringing those two sides together, and I'm really excited to see where these conversations go, and also to hopefully get to know more people on this call to build these relationships stronger, so that we can together move forward and help inform the sector better.
Thank you. Well, we are running over, so I think we will end on that note, and I'll just say, if you still have any questions and we didn't get to them today, feel free to reach out to any one of us on the project team. If this QR code may or may not be working, sorry about that. But you can, again, just reach out to any of us if you have any issues with the QR code, or signing up, or if you just have additional questions about the Thought Leadership Forum. We are always happy to answer any questions or any follow-ups that you all might have. And thank you, Darcy, for putting the link in the chat again. And with that, I think I will end our webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our presenters and our panelists, and everybody for giving your time and sticking around a little late with us to get to some questions. I'm looking forward to continuing this dialogue at future meetings. So thank you all.
Thank you.